5 years ago, Hurricane Florence impacted the Cape Fear region, bringing historic rain and flooding, destroying homes and businesses, displacing families, changing lives forever. Join WECT News as we look back. Hurricane Florence, 5 years later.
Hard to believe it has been now 5 years since Hurricane Florence came through. Anybody's first memories?
For me, probably being in the Weather Center, looking at the latest National Hurricane Center outlook when we appeared certainly 5 days out in the cone of uncertainty. That's when, for me, I really processed, oh, this is happening. This is absolutely happening.
I remember packing bags because we were under the impression we were going to be there for a couple of days, but not as long as we were. Right. And then I remember so many people leaving town. I remember my family leaving town, my friends leaving town, and I thought, oh wow, this is real.
Yeah, I remember just being at home, just, you know, when you have a family, I think that's the first thing that comes to your mind. Worrying about my wife and my kids at the time, you know, making sure they get off safely, and of course you worry about your home. You know, you're staring down the barrel of what you think might be a major hurricane that might sit over us for days and days, and you really become, you're worried about your property, your family. Just is my life going to be the same after this is all over?
Yeah, I would echo that. I almost remember the anticipation of the storm more than getting into that mode of getting through it, looking back. That was some tense times in the final run. Is it going to be a high category and perhaps a little bit quick, or does it downgrade, yet the duration? Pick your poison. It was going to be bad, so there was a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross.
Sure. I remember hoping it was not going to hit, but like you, watching that cone of uncertainty, trying to go home to pack, I could not figure out exactly what to bring, how much to bring, what would be easiest, because you never know, especially for us being on air, whether we're going to be hot, cold, you know, what's it going to be like, or make sure you've got everything there, make sure the house is okay for everything. And then I think once I knew it was happening and here, I feel like autopilot. I feel like you just jump right into the role that we know we all fulfill, and I just knew exactly what to do from there.
I remember two things. Number one, getting Sheila out of town, because at the time it was a Category 4, and the only other time she ever left was Fran, because Fran was a 4 as it was approaching 2. And the other thing that I remember, as if it was yesterday, was Fran yelling at me. when we were trying to save that hallway from basically caving in from all of the rain and the water pouring in, and we had squeegees and shock vacs, and we're just trying to take huge pieces of ceiling and get it out, and that's when the tornado warning hit.
There is a confirmed tornado. There is a confirmed tornado on the ground located near Silver Lake.
And the weather team was still talking and on the air, walking down that brick hallway, or that cement hallway. And Fran says, "John, will you turn that vacuum off? We can't hear the train." Meaning you wanted to be able to hear if a tornado actually hit you.
Yes, and I think our emotions at that point were at an all-time high.
I agree.
At that point, we became journalists, but we also became human beings who thought we could die here at this television station. It was real for me. I remember looking down, all of my co-workers were scrunched down in the hallway. We're hearing the meteorologist tell us it could be at Shipyard and Carolina Beach Road. And I'm like, hello, that's where we are. Yeah. And so we're all nervous, and you all are suctioning that water up. And I just, John, turn that off. And then the news director, Scott Saxton at the time, said to me, they're trying to save the building. And I said, and I'm trying to hear the freight train.
That's a surreal moment when you're being told, you know, I think that's the first time I've been doing this, you know, for well, at that time, well over 20 years, and to actually have to evacuate the studio.
They're telling us to go to our safe spot right now.
Yeah, we need to
We are going to need to go to our safe spot here in just a few moments. So
They want us there now.
Yeah, we need it. Let's go in the hallway. Let's go.
In the middle of a tornado warning, and I'm literally having to track this thing on my phone because we have to evacuate the studio. I mean, that's just something you'll never forget.
You're watching WECT News Hurricane Florence, 5 years later.
There's been very little activity in the Atlantic, but maybe some subtle signs that things are beginning to change tonight.
Here's a vigorous wave of low pressure with thunderstorm activity associated with coming off the coast of Africa.
It could become a tropical storm as we make our way through the evening hours tonight, or even as we get into the day for tomorrow. If it does so, that will get the name Florence.
And this is one to watch here, especially from a Bermuda standpoint, but maybe for a United States standpoint.
Tropical storm Florence out in the Atlantic has sustained winds at 70 miles per hour. So this is a pretty strong tropical storm.
One memory that sticks out to me was kind of a last-second weather meeting, Gannon, that you had called. Our team of 5 meteorologists at the time, we all kind of went into the studio, and you just put it to us straight. You're like, listen, guys, we could be looking down the barrel of a storm that we haven't seen here in some time, and that's going to be devastating. And I remember we ended that meeting with a prayer because we were that concerned about what was going to happen.
I do remember that, yeah.
The forecast track has absolutely no good news for us. Take a look at this. This is the latest forecast track from the Hurricane Center.
Refresh our memory on that. It started as a Category 4, ended as a Category 1.
Well, it was up to a 4, and at one point in the cone, it would have been suggested it would have been at least a 3 at landfall.
So really everyone along the Carolina coast needs to start making preparations for this at this point, if not for a direct impact, some strong peripheral impacts.
That's extremely troubling, quite honestly. Last few runs do this, bring the core of a major hurricane right over the Cape Fear region.
That was before the slowing happened a little bit, and so when it slowed, it also kind of ingested some continental air, and so it dropped in category. But still, the slowing that was the thing to focus on. It was still going to be a formidable storm.
But it also got larger in size as it
uncoiled,
and that made the rain actually worse. So it wasn't as strong when it hit, but we actually had a worse problem. You had a slow-moving, huge hurricane, and that's why you had so much rainfall.
It's just meandering here along the Carolina coast. That's going to mean a lot of wind, a lot of rain, a lot of storm surge.
Storm size is not rolled into that category metric. Neither is tornadoes, neither is our friends in New Bern, record surge. Nothing but the maximum sustained winds, and so Florence could kind of maybe slip into some sort of like covert operation where it's dropping in category, but it was going to be a bad actor, a very bad actor.
I mean, anybody who lived through Florence knows it felt so much worse than a Category 1 hurricane.
That is why Florence is the poster child of do not judge a hurricane by its category, do not get hung up by the categories.
But so important what you said, it is the poster child, do not go by the category.
I find myself preaching that all the time after you explain that, Gannon.
And that's been, I think that's been part of the message ever since then. As we've gone through now, you know, we're in the middle of our 5th hurricane season since. Even when storms get close, you guys have had to bring that part of the message to the forefront. Don't worry about Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3, because Bill mentioned it earlier, so many people have moved here since. All they can gauge it from is, oh, they Cat 1, I'm going to stick around. Don't.
Now you know not to.
Yeah, and that's been something you've always had to change your messaging, really, haven't you?
It's always been, it's impacts over categories. Let's focus on the impacts and start there, because the category is, it can be, and Florence was the poster child of it, an oversimplification of what the impacts might be.
Yeah, and that, like you mentioned, that is one of the things that concerns me, especially with our population growth down here in the last 5 years. There are a number of folks who have not gone through Florence that are going to focus specifically on those categories. Hopefully they have neighbors or friends that are down here that will kind of lead by example, and if we've got a storm that's coming, it's going to bring about some significant impacts. Hey, don't worry about the fact that it's a 1, 2, or whatever. it's going to cause this, be prepared ahead of time.
You're watching WECT News Hurricane Florence, 5 years later.
Attention Zone 3 Alpha, Engine 2, respond to 24 Mercer Avenue, 24 Mercer Avenue, cross street of Market and Wakefield. Reference entrapment, tree fell on the back of the house. People are trapped in the room, including a newborn and 2 adults.
I think about incidents that stood out, like the Mercer Avenue incident.
A massive tree, estimated later to weigh 80,000 pounds, had crushed part of the Johnson family's home. 3.5 hours of exhausting work had saved Adam Johnson's life.
Once we removed him, with just a little bit more digging, we saw her, and it was just immediately we knew that, that she was deceased.
Those are things that we will never ever forget, but honestly, in my mind, I can't remember what day of the storm was it. Do you?
It was Thursday.
Friday night.
Yeah,
Friday
and
night.
I think Mercer Avenue was early. Because that was a wind issue, and I think the dominoes just kept falling with the roads being closed, and then the tornado side of it was. But I agree with you. I look back, and sometimes I have to think, when was that?
But I think you're right. Mercer Avenue was early on,
yes.
And I remember thinking, this is horrible.
Yeah.
I think we all have memories of Mercer Avenue, don't we?
Oh, yes.
Because as a journalist, you build a wall. You have to. Just like a lot of people who are emergency responders, they sometimes have to build that wall to just kind of get through it. And that wall came tumbling down when we saw all those first responders just pause and gather around in prayer and saying.
That was actually, if I remember correctly, the way I remembered that was when Lester Holt, he was there because he came to cover it. He's the one who posted the picture online of all of those firefighters and emergency responders getting together in prayer, because that's when they realized that the mom and the baby had died. And they were not going to, as I did the story later on and talked to those firefighters, once they realized that the mom and the baby had died, they all came out because they knew they couldn't save them. They had gotten dad out, and then they realized that mom and baby were not going to make it. They all went outside to pray for the mom and the baby, and then they went back in and finished getting those 2 bodies out, because they weren't, it was also a shift change. They had more first responders coming in, but the first ones there from the Wilmington Fire Department, they wanted to be the ones to bring the mom and the baby out, because they felt, and I can't put myself in their place, but they felt that they failed that mom and that baby because they didn't bring them out alive. Even though there was nothing that they could have done, they still felt, to a man, they felt that they could not, that they let that family down because they didn't bring them out alive. And here now, it's been 3.5, 4 years since I did the story, but I can see in those firefighters' faces when Ryan and I did that story, that's the way those guys thought. There was nothing they could have done. They probably died instantly after getting hit, but they felt like they failed that family. And it was another one of those things where it was just so painful to watch. But we learned about it when Lester posted that picture, and then everybody started to go down.
You're watching WECT News Hurricane Florence, 5 years later.
Every so often you do a story in the news and it just makes you pause and think how random life can be. And I think that was one of the examples of that, because I think for the most part this hurricane, that was the wind and all of that kind of churning up, but this was really a rain event that really was the memory of all of this, and it just never stopped raining for days.
Yeah, if you look at the rainfall totals, I think widespread 25, I think some spots I think you were just shy of 3 feet of rain. Can you imagine 3 feet of rain? That's incredible.
And there were areas that were already decimated a couple years back.
From Matthew?
From Matthew, yeah.
2 years prior.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think about the town of Fairbluff. I mean, that just, I just, my heart goes out to those folks. I was reading somewhere that before Matthew, I think about there were 1,000 residents in Fairbluff. After Matthew and Florence, I think it's down to 350 to 400 people. So over half the people are gone from that town. I mean, it's bad enough to go through Matthew, and then just 2 years later, Florence. Both storms totally devastating to the town.
And just at the point when those decisions of whether to rebuild and how to rebuild and start executing that rebuild are happening, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes months and a couple of years. Than Florence.
I mean, you read stories about people, you know, they had just started the process of rebuilding from Matthew, and then boom, Florence hits, and they're back to square one again. It's just so tragic.
And all that flooding became apparent too with all the people that did go out of town are now trying to figure out how to get back because we lost that huge part of I-40.
Well, and I remember my twin sister who had left town and was in the Raleigh area, and on the 6th or 7th day, she says, I've got to get back home. I mean, I've got to get back home. I said, Margaret, you can't. The roads are washed out. You can't.
Surreal thing to just chart the roads and the arteries that were going out, almost falling like dominoes one by one. And at one point, I think the term was thrown out, Wilmington is an island. And that was, you almost get images of Katrina with that, even though it's totally different situation with the below sea level levees, what have you. But just think, okay, well, we're here and there's no way to get out. There's no way for services to get in, at least easily, without monumentally heavy lifting. And I just thought, hopefully everybody is staying calm and everybody has at least the bare necessities of what they need for a few days until these Highway 17 can open up, and then eventually 74, 76, and then eventually 40 that was fractured can be reopened. It was going to be a time.
I don't think that the Wilmington being cut off became apparent to me until I saw that video. And I think it was the DOT that took it, if I'm not mistaken, with a drone maybe,
the aerial,
that showed I-40 flooded over.
It's just a surreal experience to see Interstate 40 look like this.
Yeah, it didn't look like I-40.
Because you're like, wait, how did that happen? How did that happen?
That's I-40?
Yeah, and then you're thinking to yourself, we're stuck here. And then you start hearing the DOT secretary and the governor and everybody else saying, we'll get supplies in as soon as we can, and then it's like, okay, this is taking on an entirely new, recovery's going to be different than it ever was before, because you're not going to have the truckfuls of water sitting at the Kmart or Walmart parking lot or something like that. It's going to be a couple of days, and like you said, you're hoping people had those supplies, because if they didn't, they're not going to get them in the first 24, 48 hours.
Area of Stanford Dam came down, and if you're watching the footage, I mean, it looks like Niagara Falls.
Boiling Spring Lakes Dam was another one of those. Just the rate at which, you know, all of the water rising, and just watching from hour to hour how quickly that water was rising, just unbelievable. And
wasn't it the town of Kelly, too, that had issues?
Yes, and I believe, if I recall correctly, that was that one of those areas that was modeled, or had there?
Yeah, but Kelly would be vulnerable from the Cape Fear side and also the Black River side.
Black River,
So, and the Black River is less modeled, so very tenuous. Good point in Kelly as well.
Yeah.
And I think that when you talk about Boiling Spring Lakes, I think the video that shows to me is the guardrail.
Yeah.
With the road washed out underneath it and no lakes, but the guardrail is hanging after everything else went into the ground. And it's just one of those, again, like you say, the images. That image will stay with me because it's like there's no road for the guardrail to guard at this point in time.
And then all those families that were just stuck and pleading for help, for somebody to be able to get to them, because again, that was even difficult.
I think another thing that stands out to me about the aftermath of the storm is, of course, when it was bad enough, obviously, going through the rain, it was bad enough going through the tornadoes, but then we weren't done with the storm. We had the rivers to deal with.
Standing in the middle of Highway 210 in Pender County. Yes, this is the middle of Highway 210 at the Black River in Pender County, a major east-west that runs across the county, but right now it looks more like a river runs through it.
All of them almost had, you know, record, in some cases, 500-year floods. It was just the amount of water, when you have that much rain falling, that was another aspect to the storm.
And a lot of those rivers are well modeled, so we were able to give people information.
All area rivers continue to flow in a state of major flood.
As to when they would likely crest and how bad they would likely crest. One thing that sticks out to me in the days after the storm was the number of people who reached out who lived on the lesser charted tributaries that aren't modeled, and people expressing to me that the water is rising greater than they've ever seen it. How high is it going to get? And us, only be able to give a hazy answer, just because we had gotten into such uncharted territory with some of those tributaries especially.
The images were unbelievable. I remember horses with water up to their necks. I remember people being rescued from roofs of houses. The images to me told everything.
Yeah, I remember covering a story in a neighborhood off the Burgaw exit there with the water. These houses were built on stilts. They were built 12, 15 feet in the air, and still, when you walked in the homes, all the sheetrock was gone because the water got higher than that, and they had to start over.
And a lot of those homes were built that high after, I think, Hurricane Floyd.
Yeah.
Right.
Because of the, so they thought, that they were going to be okay.
But you can also close your eyes and still for months see the mountains of trash, the mountains of what was people's homes, of their lives at the side of the road, especially out in some of the rural areas.
It's tragic.
It really was.
You're watching WECT News Hurricane Florence, 5 years later.
You know what really stands out for me for Hurricane Florence, even 5 years later, was the compassion after the storm. It was amazing to me, and even during the storm, I think we were different people during that time. I go back to Mercer Avenue, and I remember the picture of the first responders kneeling and praying. You know, these are people who respond to tragic incidents all the time. This was different for them, and it was different for us because we, as journalists, have to turn those emotions off and do the story.
We just got this information in from the Wilmington Police Department.
Yeah, they are now saying a mother and an infant died when the tree fell on their home.
And we, to some extent, did that with the Mercer Avenue story, but then we saw those first responders, and it took on a different meaning.
Anytime a child's involved, human life certainly, but when it's involving a child, people push themselves to the limit, and that comes with an emotional toll as well.
But in the big picture of Hurricane Florence 5 years later, I just remember this community being as compassionate as I've ever seen it. And we've been through many hurricanes, but I saw people coming out of the woodwork, as they say, trying to help their neighbors and even strangers.
Wow. It's one of the nice things about living here that I have come to love about living here over the almost past decade is, you know, when things are great, people are extremely kind, but even in times of trouble, that is really when this community steps up.
Absolutely.
And comes together. And I 100% agree with you. Just the love, the outpouring. Everyone in some way was impacted by Florence, some worse than others, but it's all about lending a helping hand.
What else do you all remember about the storm?
Well,
I remember Chelsea Donovan's story.
Yeah,
that was
Wow. I hate
devastating.
that I thought about that when you were talking about compassion.
Yeah, I did.
Then I
too.
started
I was kind of thinking the
about,
flip. There's the flip
shoot,
side.
But I
yeah.
do remember something I saw that I hurt my heart to see anybody in Wilmington doing that, looting that store and not caring about people. That was heartbreaking.
You can see here people coming out with items left and right, looting the Family Dollar here on Greenfield Street. Can see inside just a complete mess. People taking duffel bags and trash bags, now noticing that we're here, running away from the camera. You can see people inside here, people with t-shirts over their heads, coming out with bags of items.
Well, it was terrifying to watch Chelsea Donovan. She is a beast of a reporter, but I remember looking at this is live television, and I remember thinking, this could end badly. She's confronting people on live television and telling them, do you realize you are looting? She's confronting people who have no regard for the law, much less a television news reporter, and my fear was something bad could happen here. She was totally fearless. We were terrified what could happen.
I think it also spoke to the desperation that some people were feeling about not being able to have access to some of those supplies, or waiting for a very long time for something to happen that never came that particular day. So I'm not justifying what happened with that looting because it's just downright wrong, but I think it also spoke to people who, in an environment where they don't necessarily know what's going on, they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, that it just kind of spoke to, oh my gosh, you know, this is my answer.
WECT News Hurricane Florence. 5 years later, we'll be right back. You're watching WECT News Hurricane Florence. 5 years later.
Another very just visual moment, and one of those moments that, you know, sort of scares you a little bit. Our friend Colin Hackman, who is, we know, a tremendous meteorologist, a tremendous reporter. I always tell people, don't worry about when Jim Cantori comes here. If we send Colin out into the field, you know that this is a storm to pay attention to.
With wind speeds in excess now, easily, woo! Here we go.
Yeah, Colin, be careful out there, buddy. But boy, in Carolina Beach.
Oh gosh, don't even.
That morning.
And I know maybe you haven't had a chance to go check out the ocean at all, but were you able to see it from your room? Are you ocean side? Or?
Yeah, we can't see it.
Ooh, oh gosh, Colin.
Yeah. We just lost our life. You absolutely went Mama Ratcliffe on
I
him.
did. I was Colin. Get inside.
Rightfully so.
That scared me. That scared me.
That was crazy, wasn't it?
You're not-
We
you're
saw
not
Gus there probably.
You're not allowed to go back
I'm
outside.
in.
You don't understand.
Mama Kim says I come inside, I come inside.
Okay.
I do what Kim says.
Exactly.
She trumps everything. Yeah, no problem. No, that was obviously, that's why you don't go outside during a hurricane. You get some strong, 90+ mile/per-hour winds coupled with the effect of the building beside us, and that made it difficult to walk. In fact, Luke stumbled to his knee. We lost the camera there for a second. Everybody's okay. But our pride is all that's hurt. We're indoors. I ain't got no problem with that.
I just got chills.
Yeah, what was crazy about it, though, I mean, Colin, has been through storms before. He's always, kind of stepping over that line a little bit. But his photographer at the time, Lucas, who's, 6 foot, seemingly 11, built like a brick chicken house, to have a wind gust close to 100 miles an hour knock that man over. And that was the scary point where it's, the wind gust hit, all of a sudden the signal cuts out. You don't know what happens.
No, we're all.
Take us back to that, Kim. Take us back. Yeah. Take us back.
I just remember them standing in that wind and that rain and thinking to myself, yeah, I turned into Mama Ratcliffe on the air, telling them to not do what they're doing to get in.
My feet were airborne. The CNN crew that's here, they were talking about us, I guess, for 2 minutes on CNN as the news crew that
you
was
made the
floating
national
away
news for almost blowing away. Great, yeah.
Yeah, we've arrived. Yeah.
It was horrifying to watch those two. Colin was. He was standing his ground, I'll give him that. But
no, he was a bad child. I'm going to do this. I am fearless.
I'm
going to
Thank
do
you.
it.
Bad child. There you go.
Well, you joke and say bad child, but our news director at the time, who I've known for 20 years, who's a journalist with a capital J, actually stepped back from that position after that in much the same vein of thought, and was like, you know what, I felt like I became parents and was sending my children out to something that I didn't want to send them out to.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
It was like, you know, it was very frightening.
It just about 15 minutes before that, the same part of the eye wall had passed over the station. So I think that was where your mindset was, because I remember you and I were there, and we could hear damage happen on the roof, probably some part of the HVAC at that point. But I remember the pressure change. I likened it to being inside a compressed can of like tuna, and then just somebody popping up, open the lid. You could feel the pressure change, and that got our adrenaline going. Next thing you know, you see Colin in the same part of the storm, and it had wobbled down. And only he's not under a housed roof at that point. Right. So we were all very concerned.
And I don't know if a lot of people realize, but some of those reporters that we sent out, you know, they pair up, they go out with as much equipment, as much supplies as they possibly can. We ask them to go stay wherever we can put them up. We had one in, I think, a salesperson's house. We had one hunkering down with a fire rescue department. And these kids have not been doing their jobs for very long. You know, and they did amazing work out in the field like that. But then, yes, as soon as they start coming back, you just want to hug them and say, God, you did such a great job. You know, and you do. You turn into a parent.
And we were glad they had a place to come back to, because, again, for a time it was iffy, because you used your contacts. People may not realize this, but is this building going to go? You were working the phones to get us a place to spend the night or to be able to broadcast from around town. And no one's really picking up the phone going, gee, I wonder who's calling now. You know, lots of places were shut down, and, you know, we had to take everybody and evacuate this building for a while.
And then we all came back. Because we had to be on the air. So we, during all of that, I think it was while we were sleeping. That was our time to sleep, and we were supposed to be on the air. I think the shifts were midnight to midnight, if I remember. But they came in and said, we got to go. You guys have got to leave. And at that time, I think part of the water had started coming into the conference room where I was staying, all over the air mattresses and everything else. So we packed up and left, and then figured out that, okay, you guys were on here, and they weren't able to establish another set back at the location that we had found. And next thing we're thinking is, we got to get back somehow. And driving in it was not fun, even though it was right down the road.
They had actually shut down the roads or instituted a curfew at that point, correct?
Yeah.
So, yeah, we were kind of breaking curfew to get in and out, but also like
we had
to.
I remember looking at the general manager and saying, we have to be on the air in like an hour. We have to relieve John and Fran. We've got to get back. Can we go ahead and go back to the station? And I ended up coming back here soaking wet. You know, thank goodness we had power.
And I'm glad you brought that up, Bill, because, I mean, we were at a point of wondering, are we going to be able to continue broadcasting from here? And I do have to say thank you to Coastal Horizons and Pine Valley Methodist Church, who opened up for us not just a place to put our heads, but the possibility we might have to broadcast from there, because this television station is in serious trouble.
And really with no idea how long we might have to stay there.
We were really living on the edge there for a while.
Yeah. And there's a lot of discussion about that. What should we do? You know, other people making the decisions, of course.
It gives you pause, because I guess a year or two ago, some of the stations along Florida's Gulf had to get out when the massive storm, was it last year, 2 years ago, I forget, when the Gulf Coast of Florida got hit by a Cat 4.
Could have been Ian of last year.
And you hear, obviously it's hundreds of miles away from here, but you hear and you see video of those people evacuating their TV stations, and you realize how close we came.
Exactly.
And you're thinking, what must be getting ready to happen there if they're having to, because of what we went through and still stayed here.
You're watching WECT News Hurricane Florence, 5 years later.
Keyword, what's everybody's takeaway from this?
pay attention. You know, it's a week out. A little X that Gannon's talking about in the morning.
And this is one to watch here.
I should pay attention to that. I may not have to worry about it, but I should pay attention to it.
You know, I think people get gun shy. Is that it's only a Cat 1, it may hit, so I'm not going to worry about it. And I think Bill's point is well taken, is that, no, you may not have to worry about it, but at least know what you're going to do. Know where you're going to go. Know when you're going to make that call. Know when you're going to send Sheila inland. Know when Bill and Hunter, where they're going to go. Know where family's going to go. Because I also remember they actually had buses of people evacuating from here, going to Raleigh and to Greensboro and to Greenville before this one came.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've heard from first responders and the police department saying, you know what, you've been told to evacuate. So if the time comes when you need to evacuate and you call us, there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to help you.
Right. And that may sound crass.
Sobering.
But also people don't realize, and I think I saw this when I did the Memories of Mercer Avenue story, when I asked the fire chief, they had shot video of the fire engine going to Mercer Avenue at the height of the storm. And they were just going through 3rd Street, whatever it was, through downtown Wilmington. That was scary enough for me to realize why they say there's going to be a point. We're not going to send a fire truck to you. We can't send an ambulance to you. So you got to know where you're going to be when the worst hits. Because they're not going to put a fire engine full of brave individuals at risk. And that's why they closed the Snows Cut Bridge down. Because you put an engine or a box ambulance and the bad gust of wind, it's going right over the side of that bridge. That's why paying attention and knowing where you're supposed to be, even though we say it how many times in the days ahead of time, it's so important to people to realize what they're going to do to keep themselves and their families safe.
I want to key in on the word days, because we get days now. When this TV station opened in 1954, in many respects still benchmark storm, at least categorically, not that that's the be-all end-all, but is Hazel as a Cat 4 in fall of 1954. The lead time there was hours. So it's go mode at that point. What do you do with the days that you get? The anxiety is visceral, but the best memories I have from Florence in the days and, as it were, weeks ahead, because it took a long time to cross the ocean, and certainly in the days that we were dealing with and days after, is when the anxiety and the worry and that energy was turned into positive action. Those were the best things that I saw from everyone here, my neighbors, my family, and people I'd never met before, but you see through social media what they're doing to help before, during, and after.
Well, if I can share my takeaways, and I have a couple. First and foremost, I think we learned that this community is so resilient, and to me, I can't think of a place I'd rather live. Our weather team, phenomenal. And no, we're not supposed to sing our own praises, but I am. No one ever looked to you all and criticized or found fault with what you were doing, because you were spot on. And we clung on to every single word you said, because we didn't know what this storm was going to do, but you all were incredible, and so I am singing your praises. I really am.
And patient when we asked over and over again. You got to ask the same question.
Oh, yes.
Don't wear Superman t-shirts underneath there.
My last takeaway is when the meteorologist, our weather team, says you got to get out of town or this could be a very powerful storm. We've been through a lot of hurricanes, and so I know that when the word is leave if you can, you need to leave. And here's what I think viewers need to know. We always have the option to stay or go. Most of us stay because this is what we do. I'm going to be honest with you all. If you all were to say, we've got a Cat 4 or God forbid a Cat 5 storm coming, at my age, after all that we have been through with past hurricanes, and particularly Hurricane Florence from 5 years ago, I'm going to have to give it pause. I am the oldest person here, and these storms you have to take very seriously. Florence, we all survived. There were those who did not, the mother and her child. And so if we were given a Cat 4 or Cat 5 storm, now at this stage in my career, I would really have to pause and say, am I going to stay? I didn't mean to get emotional about that for sure. But that's just to say how powerful Florence was. I mean, I still remember going home knowing it's going to take a while to get my house back in order. I remember trying to calm my sister down. You can't get back home, Margaret, the roads are washed out. The reality is I will probably stay because this is what I love. But it is something that I seriously, at this stage in my career, would think about. And I would say to anyone, when you're given the warning to evacuate, take heed.
A friend mentioned that you have to give some thought to staying, but there's not another group of people who I've ever worked with or probably ever will work with that I'd rather go through something like that than this group here. I mean, you know, we've been together for a long time, many of us, and been through different kinds of storms. Bad ones, ones that glanced. We just have to be prepared to do whatever it is we can while we work alongside one another. And, you know, yeah, it gets tense, but, you know, in the end, we're doing it for the right reason, you know.
I think that is a beautiful way to end this. We did work very well together. We did. And I feel like we got closer after Florence. I mean, we were a family before, but we were even closer after Florence. And I'm just glad to call you all family.
Thank you for watching WECT News Hurricane Florence, 5 years later, sponsored by Shafani and Bailey.